Hello everybody, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and today we are going to jump inside the Hawker Sea Fury. This is possible courtesy of Navy Wings. Navy Wings, of course, being a UK-based charity organization who try to preserve the history of the Fleet Air Arm and also keep these aircraft flying. If you're interested in supporting their mission, do check out the description below for a link to their website, and there you can find information on how to get involved. Now, before I'm going to do the walk around and then jump inside the Sea Fury as per usual, a few words on its history. We are in the mid stages of World War II, 1942 and 1943. And the RAF really likes what Hawker has done with the Typhoon and the Tempest. However, they look at the Tempest and they say, it would be nice, Hawker, if we could have a lighter version of this aircraft. And Hawker agrees and says, yeah, sure, we can do that. And they get cracking. Some of the changes they introduced are a shorter span on the aircraft, as well as a higher cockpit position, and the fuselage is also now fully monocoque. As the prototype is being developed, it becomes 1944, and the RAF realizes, oh, we are winning this thing that's called World War II, and maybe we don't need all these new planes that we have on order, and they start cutting back. This Hawker Fury is one of the victims of this cutback. However, at the same time, the Royal Navy had already signaled that it was interested as well, hence why we have the Sea Fury, right? The Sea Fury was interesting to the Royal Navy because of the simple reason that currently in its inventory it was flying Seafires, navalized Spitfires, which Spitfires were great aircraft, but navalized versions weren't all that great. And they were also flying American Vought Corsairs, which they got via Lend-Lease. They hadn't paid for them yet, and they would only be paying for the ones that would be left over at the end of the war. So suddenly, aircraft started disappearing mid-voyage, just being chucked overboard. So the Royal Navy, of course, knew that in advance, that it needed something that is homegrown and able to be built here in the UK rather than being reliant on an export aircraft coming from the States or elsewhere. So the Sea Fury was the answer to that. In 1944, when the prototype was flying, we had a couple of prototypes actually. One was flying, for example, with the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine. The other one was flying with the Bristol Centaurus. You have then also carrier trials starting at the end of the war, actually after the war, 1946. First on HMS Victorious and later on HMS Illustrious. And in 1947, the aircraft was introduced into the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm as a carrier-borne fighter. Of course, this was also to be the last piston-engined fighter within the Royal Navy's inventory, because it comes at that transitionary phase from the piston-engine aircraft to the jet engine aircraft. What we have with the Hawker Sea Fury as well then is a really rather interesting operational history. The Royal Navy, of course, uses it in Korea, and they also start popping up here and there around the world. For example, the Dutch used them on their carrier, the Karel Doorman, which used to be an ex-Royal Navy carrier. And West Germany also bought a couple of them, mainly as cargo drones, it must be said. In 1955, the aircraft was retired. In total, 850 of these aircraft would be built. And with that said and done, let's have a closer look then at the Sea Fury. We're going to start up, as always, up front with the engine, walking around the now folded wing towards the tail, looping around on the port side, coming back on the engine. By the way, if you're going to hear noise in the background, we're on an active airfield. Well, it's not too live, right? That's just the sound of aviation that you're going to have to contend with. Up front, 5-bladed constant speed propeller, which gives the Sea Fury that, well, really that trademark look, I would say. When we come up front then, right behind the propeller, we of course have the power plant. This is the Bristol Centaurus Mark 18. And this gives the pilot roughly 2,500 Jeremy Clarksons to work with. It has a 2-stage supercharger and weighs around about 1,200 kilograms. The aircraft then, behind the engine block, has the exhausts, which are nicely placed, rather streamlined here. In fact, if you look at the fuselage and the overall construction of the Sea Fury, it's a very clean design, with also the cooling air outlet over there. We then also have a firewall separating these elements from the fuel tank and the oil tank. The oil tank situated round about here on the top half of the engine cowling, 60 liters roughly, as well as two fuel tanks, one with 440 liters and the other one with 130 liters. Although they're two separate fuel tanks, we really should consider them as one, giving you a fuel load of 570 liters in the engine block over here. That's going to become important very soon. Moving then over to the gear, the Hawker Fury is of course a tail dragger, means it has two wheels up front and one in the back, and it stands at that angle, right? And these are operating with pneumatic brakes and a differential control via the rudders to make ground taxiing easy on the pilot. Then the wing. Now, the wing is constructed out of two main spars, which are of course interrupted at the wing fold, and then the ribs that you would associate with that sort of construction, right? The first main spar running perfectly perpendicular with the fuselage, the rear spar angling in towards the main spar and then running parallel to it, roundabout where you see the ailerons. Looking at the wing then, here we have the first carburetor air intake on this side, and on inside the wing we also have two fuel tanks. One fuel tank 120 liters, the other one 80 liters. These fuel tanks continuously top up the main fuel tanks as soon as they reach a volume of 530 liters, and they keep them topped up at that level until they themselves are depleted, at which point of course the main tanks are going to be depleted. So it's an automatic fuel transfer that occurs mid-flight. Moving over then to the wing fold, these two muzzles right here, well, they belong to the Hispano Mark V cannons. 20 millimeter in caliber and 145 rounds per gun, which is good enough, let's say. Looking then at the wing fold, now you can of course see the semi-elliptical shape of the wing. It's somewhat reminiscent of course of the earlier Hawker designs as well. We have the first flap over here, and then of course the aileron on the going all the way towards the wingtip. On the wingtip, of course, we have also the navigational lights that you would associate with that sort of position. We have identification lights also looking downwards, and you can see also on the aileron the big trim tab. That is the one that the pilot operates mid-flight, whereas this one is the fixed trim tab that can be preset on the ground. The flaps here, generally we have the first flap here and another flap which is slightly larger over here. Those are simple split flaps, so you have the wing, you have the flap, and it just pops out like so. There's a couple of settings of course available to the pilot depending on what he needs, whether he's landing, taking off, or mid-flight. Right, moving over then towards the cockpit. The cockpit, of course, the pilot's being protected up front from an armored windscreen, and in the back an armored headrest as well as an armored back seat plate as well. The bubble top canopy that slides just in parallel with the fuselage, and then round about here, actually right here, we have the fuselage construction that commences. And this is fabricated out of 7 frames held together by stingers, starting round about here, moving our way all the way until the fuselage sort of hits the tail section. Looking downwards, of course, we have a fully swiveling tail wheel that can be retracted into this compartment here. In the back, we also already see the arrestor hook. Since this is a navalized aircraft, that is important. During landing on a carrier, you will have to hit those wires. And then if we come back up onto the control surfaces, we have, of course, the vertical stabilizer, aerial on top, as well as the horizontal stabilizer. As we then loop around, just follow me, we have the elevators plus a trim tab, and the rudder plus an additional trim tab for the yaw here as well as then the mass balance right here. Moving then to the port side, there's a small navigational light over here, and then, as I said, this is a very clean design, so what you're seeing here is pretty much mirroring what is available on the other side. But then we come to this side, and behind the pilot, should be mentioned, that's where the radio sets are situated, the transmitters and the receivers. And then we come, of course, to the position where the pilot would mount onto the aircraft. We have a handhold here, we've got a footrest here, and of course a deployable and retractable footrest here as well, which you might be familiar with if you've already seen the designs such as the Hawker Hurricane. Has very similar design characteristics. So you would just tank a handhold here and you would jump up. There's a footrest here which deploys inwards as well, and then you just jump up like so. Of course, then you would go inside. We're not just going to do that yet, don't worry, we will do that soon. What you will see on the wing here are those blisters. That shows you where the ammunition feed is into the cannons. And if you follow me, I will show you something really interesting as well. This is where those connection links would be feeding the 20mm rounds into the cannon, whereas the ammunition storage would be right about here. So that's the ammo compartment for the outboard cannon. So now there are two distinct differences in this scene that you might have noticed. First of all, the wing is down, and the second difference, I'll let you find that one. But with the power of editing, all of this is seamless, so you haven't seen anything. With the wing is down, I want to talk about the external stores. The Sea Fury, of course, can carry drop tanks, 45 or 90-gallon drop tanks, or air-to-ground weaponry like bombs. So on the FB-11, you had, for example, 1,000-pound bomb that could be carried on either wing. And beyond that, of course, semi-armor piercing bombs, flares, floats, depth charges, mines even. What you wanted, it generally could be carried. The FB-11, as with the suffix that tells you already what the role of this aircraft is, fighter bomber, FB, right? That was a change in the aircraft's initial design, because initially it was called the Sea Fury Mark 10, right? Mark 10 as in the Roman numeral 10, which is an X. Then that got changed in the late 40s with the nomenclatura change in Britain to F10, Arabic numeral 10, and then of course with the increase in ordnance being placed on this aircraft, FB-11 became the new suffix. And beyond that change in the aircraft, getting an increased air-to-ground complement added to it, a powered wing fold was added as well for the aircraft to deploy its wings. And beyond that, you could of course also do it manually with a hand pump. Then moving over to the front section, the leading edge of the wing. Aha, this is new. You didn't see this on the starboard side, did you? No. This is the automatic oil cooler that of course cools the oil system for the engine in this air-cooled radial engine. Of course, the cylinder heads and so on, those are cooled by air coming in through the cowling. This is where the oil cooler would be situated. And interestingly as well, remember how I told you on the starboard wing that there are two fuel tanks, a 120-liter fuel tank as well as a 80-liter fuel tank? Well, on the port wing, we only have that 120-liter fuel tank. A little bit of an asymmetry there in the design. And then of course we also, looking back at the engine, we find the hydraulic reservoir here as well, and we can have a nice little look as well into the gear bay right here, where it would retract inwards, of course, as you might expect from a design like this. And yeah, that rounds us up on the outside. Why don't we jump inside and see what makes this aircraft tick? Sitting in the Sea Fury, let's go through the cockpit instruments and gauges, starting as always on the left, working our way across the front and then to the right. Mind you, as Naval Wings is dedicated to keeping these aircraft flying, certain elements of the cockpit instrumentation will have changed from the original layout. On the far left, we have the oxygen regulator control. Originally, you would also find your IFF unit, your signaling flares, and your camera controls, as well as the ordnance selector switches for your outboard pylons, as well as the RATOG jettison button roundabout here. RATOG stands for Rocket Assisted Takeoff Gear. It's essentially a JATO system. Next to this, you will find the rudder and elevator trim wheel and your bomb rack jettison. A hydraulic hand pump is right next to the seat, and this is for the wing fold. And I will now demonstrate this together with Drachenefo. As we visited together, Naval Wings allowed us to experience the joys of operating the wing fold by manually deploying them. And as I'm a smart cookie, I volunteered to deploy them. But even then, it took some work. Basically, you set the system found to the right behind the seat and then pump about a gazillion times until you start to feel more resistance. You keep pumping and eventually one of the wings will deploy. The pump's resistance then will slacken again, but your job ain't done yet. You keep pumping, and these are the moments you work out for after all, and then eventually resistance will increase again as there's enough pressure in the hydraulical system, but you just keep on pumping until it's all the way down. It took me just about short of 2 minutes to get both wings lowered and locked. And meanwhile, Drakenifel the poor man was laboring away for an eternity to get them back up again. Now back to the instruments. Moving forward, throttle quadrant. On there you will find the supercharger gear change lever, your fuel cutoff, the throttle with an integrated Draytok firing button, and your prop hitch control. Next to this, the flap selector set above the undercarriage lever, its safety catch, and the arrestor hook release. And below all of this, on the bottom of the cockpit, you will find your relief tube for, well, you know. Moving forward, the undercarriage position indicator next to the ignition switches and a remote indicating compass. Above this, you will find your supercharger warning light, a stopwatch, and a G meter, as well as the flap position indicator. In front, starting on the top, we have the undercarriage warning light, a fire extinguisher, a speedometer, and the altimeter. The artificial horizon is behind the stick, just above the directional compass, with a vertical speedometer and turn and slip indicator to its right. Cockpit lighting switches can be found above this, next to the windscreen de-icing pump. And then to the right, set at a slight angle, we find the engine control gauges. Up top, we have oil temperature and pressure, followed by cylinder head temperature, as well as your boost gauge in the middle, and then your RPM and a hydraulic pressure gauge. Your canopy control flywheel is set to the top right. Proceeding over to the right hand side then, we have the canopy emergency release and your triple pressure gauges for brakes and your undercarriage. And another pressure gauge. I assume this has something to do with the hydraulical system, perhaps the wing fault. It's not in the original manual. Your fuel cock is set next to the drop tank jettison selector and control, and an air pressure gauge for the outboard fuel tanks is found here as well. A UHF VHF selector is above this, and the flaps and undercarriage emergency release is set to its left. The heating control and tailwheel locking lever can also be found here. Then we come to the engine and lighting control panel. On top, the fuel level warning light and the engine starters. From left to right now, the cartridge booster coil starter and the cylinder and ejection primer push buttons. Your main tank fuel gauge and your nose and wing tank fuel gauges are also found here. And next to this, your downward identification lights with signaling push buttons and color select. Below this, the air intake warning lights and filter selector, as well as your pitot tube heater and navigational light switches. The larger switch you see is for the battery master switch for external and internal power. Following this, further to the right, your air intake cooling lever, as well as your fuel pump circuit breaker and test push buttons. The wing fault control lever, shown previously, is found to the far right. And then between your legs you will find your control stick. Found behind this is the radio control, with a modern modification of course. In the olden days, this location would also house a larger compass. The spade-shaped stick itself is simple. You will find your press to transmit for the radio on top, next to the firing button that is covered by a safety catch. And on the rear side is the brake lever, as well as an integrated parking brake catch. And all the way in front, a whiskey compass, as well as a modern Garmin GPS. Not a sponsor, although Garmin, if you see this, my inbox is open. Of course, originally this area would be reserved for the gun side. And there you have it, the Sea Fury's cockpit. Now let's go through some of the takeoff and flying information. So in order to start the engine on the Sea Fury for takeoff, we obviously have a Lynx taking off right now, so you're going to hear a lot of propeller noise. But if you wanted to take off with the Sea Fury, obviously you're going to a couple of pre-start checks. You're also making sure that your emission switches are set to off initially, that your main fuel tank is set to on, booster pumps to off. You open up the throttle just slightly, 0.5 of an inch. You push the RPM lever into maximum. You put your supercharger into low gear, that's M. You make sure that the air intake heater is set to off, that the air intake is open to either clean or filtered, and that the tail wheel is of course locked. At that point, the blades will be turned by the ground crew a couple of times, and as they're doing that, you're priming the injector of the engine. You're setting the ignition to on, obviously having shouted clear before that. You're setting the starter booster coils, and you push those until the engine starts to run smoothly. As it does that, you are warming it up at 1,200 RPMs, 15 degrees Celsius on your oil coolers, and 120 degrees Celsius on your cylinder heads. You wait for those temperatures, and then you push the stick back slightly. You check your boost readings, you check that your generator is charging, and then you're going to, in a couple of engine tests, you're taking your RPM lever, you're pushing it, either pulling it all the way back, you're pushing it into maximum again, and if that works fine, good, continue. You're testing the supercharger by setting it into high gear, and at this point you will also be noticing a drop in the RPMs. You're going to flick your magnetos to see also a corresponding decrease in RPM. If it's a slight increase, that's good. If it's a massive decrease, that's bad. And then you're essentially ready for takeoff as the engine is getting ready. Taking off from a carrier for flaps, you set those into a takeoff position. From a catapult, you're setting those into max lift, and if you're taking off from an airfield, you can take off with no flaps, or of course the takeoff flap position is option as well. You're doing this by going into max power. Takeoff power is max power, 2,700 RPMs, and 9.5 pounds per square inch on your boost. And that will also propel you in a straight line. That will also propel you in a straight line to 780 kilometers per hour with no external stores, and of course also below 10,000 feet. But that is really pure top speed right there. You climb out generally at sort of 340 kilometers an hour below 20,000 feet, and you drop that speed just slightly with every 4,000 foot of altitude. Cruising in this aircraft, set it to 2,400 RPMs, 2.5 to 6.5 on your boost, although there's actually an automatic limiter which does not allow you to go over 4.5 on your boost. And landing, you're going to do that just as per usual in an aircraft like this. Touchdown speed is roughly 185 to 200 kilometers an hour. And yeah, that rounds us up here on the engine portion and in the cockpit. I hope that you enjoyed this inside the cockpit, and if you did, please consider, of course, also supporting Navy Wings, who are trying to get this bird back into the sky. Check out the description for a link to their organization, more information available there. And of course, please also consider supporting the channel via either Patreons or channel memberships, because that is what makes Inside the Cockpit work, that what allows me to go to museums, to visit organizations such as Navy Wings, and bring this sort of content into your living room. So if you enjoyed, check it out. And as always, I wish all of you a great day, and see you in the sky.